It was a moment that few in Washington expected to see. As Prime Minister Mark Carney stepped onto the red carpet in Kuala Lumpur, ASEAN leaders rose to greet him with applause. Cameras captured a rare sight. Canada at the center of an Asian summit, welcomed not as a visitor but as a partner. For months, the United States had been raising tariffs, tightening borders, and warning its allies to follow suit. Yet there was Canada doing the opposite, expanding outward, talking trade, energy, and cooperation. What happened in Malaysia was more than a diplomatic stop. It was a declaration that Canada intends to shape its own future, even if that future no longer revolves around Washington.
Last week that we want to increase our non-U.S. exports by 50% within the next decade, shorter time frame than that. It's about $300 billion to give context to that.
That's a good thing for Canadians to understand, that we're not just on bended knee hoping that Donald Trump will stop doing things that don't make any sense. We're not going to rely on the Americans anymore because they've turned out to be very unreliable, at least under the current administration. So
Carney's trip to Asia was his first as Prime Minister, and he chose the Asian Summit in Malaysia for a reason. Canada wanted to send a clear message. It is ready to engage directly with the fastest-growing region on Earth. The reception could not have been warmer. Regional newspapers described Canada as a dependable new voice in an uncertain world. In the summit hall, delegates highlighted Canada's consistent support for a rules-based system and fair trade. It was a contrast to the transactional tone that has defined U.S. policy in recent years. ASEAN represents a market of more than $650 million people and a combined GDP exceeding $4 trillion U.S. According to the International Monetary Fund, the region is projected to grow around 4.5% in 2025, making it a crucial partner for any nation seeking long-term economic stability. For Canada, which still sends roughly 75% of its exports to the United States, Statistics Canada 2024, the opportunity was obvious. Carney framed the visit as a turning point, a chance for Canada to connect its advanced industries with Asia's demand for energy, minerals, and technology. He described Canada as a nation that shares ASEAN's values of inclusivity and sustainability. Behind the diplomatic language was a simple truth. Canada was ready to diversify and Asia was ready to welcome it. Carney laid out a measurable plan. Within 10 years, Canada aims to double its non-US exports by 300 billion Canadian dollars, much of it from Asia. The foundation is energy and innovation. Canada is one of the world's top LG producers, projected to export 50 million tons annually by 2030. Meanwhile, 85% of its power grid is clean, with expansion focused on small modular nuclear reactors and renewables. By 2035, Canada is also advancing in critical minerals through a critical mineral alliance linking its vast resources to Asian demand. The 2025 federal budget pledged to quadruple defense and tech spending over 5 years, prioritizing AI, cybersecurity, and advanced manufacturing. Together, these measures form an industrial strategy that combines energy security, clean technology, and digital strength into one national vision. While Carney was being toasted in Kuala Lumpur, the atmosphere in Washington was tense. President Trump had just threatened another round of 10% tariffs in Canadian imports, citing unfair trade practices. The intention was to pressure Ottawa into compliance. Instead, it triggered something else: acceleration. Canada's pivot to Asia has become a direct response to the very trade barriers meant to contain it. When the U.S. closed its doors, Canada opened new ones. Trade analysts from the Peterson Institute in Washington noted in early October 2025 that tariff escalation is diverting investment and supply chains toward non-U.S. partners. That shift is already visible in the data. According to Global Affairs Canada, exports to Indo-Pacific economies reached 261 billion Canadian dollars in 2024, and new agreements signed with the European Union, Japan, South Korea, and now ASEAN could raise that number by hundreds of billions more within a decade. Every deal reduces the share of Canadian trade tied to the U.S. market. For Washington, this was never part of the plan. Trump's America First approach was supposed to strengthen the U.S. position within North America. Instead, it weakened it by relying on tariffs as leverage. The administration pushed allies to seek alternatives. The result: Canada is no longer the quiet neighbor adapting to U.S. rules. It is emerging as an independent trade power with its own network across the Pacific. Carney's vision defines Canada as a nation connecting Western systems with Asia's fast-growing markets. This approach is already reflected in policy. Canada's trade frameworks mix Western transparency with Asian flexibility, supporting carbon pricing and clean energy standards while offering financing models suited to Asian economies. By stepping into the space, Canada fills a gap left by Washington's retreat. Leaders across Asia see Ottawa as modern, predictable, and open to practical cooperation. The challenge now is to balance principles with pragmatism, a balance that makes Canada newly relevant in 2025. The symbolism of this trip resonated far beyond Asia. In Europe, financial newspapers described it as Canada's diplomatic breakout. In Ottawa, economists pointed out that the strategy mirrors global trends, diversification, regional blocs, and the rise of mid-sized powers shaping their own paths. The Financial Times reported on October 24th that Carney's Indo-Pacific Initiative could attract over 500 billion Canadian dollars in combined public and private investment over the next decade. That figure aligns with Ottawa's internal projection of a $500 billion growth plan, an ambitious but realistic target given Asia's scale. These moves are changing how global investors see Canada. Once considered an extension of the U.S. economy, it is now viewed as a Pacific gateway for Western capital. The Toronto Stock Exchange's index of resource and tech firms has outperformed the S&P 500 since mid-2025, partly due to optimism over Asian demand for Canadian minerals, energy, and clean tech components. Every handshake in Kuala Lumpur and every announcement in Singapore sends the same message. Canada intends to lead through partnership, not confrontation. As the ASEAN summit concluded, Carney stood alongside regional leaders beneath the bright stage lights, smiling as the cameras flashed. It was more than a photo opportunity. It was the image of a country quietly transforming its role in the world. Back in Washington, the reaction was muted but unmistakable. Commentators on major networks admitted that America's tariff strategy might have backfired. Canada, once seen as a secondary player, had turned adversity into opportunity. The shift is profound. By choosing collaboration over conflict, Canada has begun to build a new identity, one grounded in confidence, partnership, and independence. It is no longer waiting for permission to act on the world stage. In 2025, while America isolates itself behind its own barriers, Canada is walking into Asia's open doors. The question now is not whether this pivot will succeed, but how far it can go. Because in the global race for influence, this may be the year when Canada finally stops following and starts leading.
The diplomatic relationship between Canada and China appears to be on the mend after years of strain and a more recent escalation in trade tensions, with both Ottawa and Beijing agreeing to reopen communication lines, potentially paving the way for a summit between Mark Carney and Xi Jinping.
Across the headlines this week, On Story stands out. Canada and China are rebuilding ties after years of silence. Foreign Minister Anita Anand's visit to Beijing has reopened diplomatic channels, and both sides are now preparing for a possible summit between Prime Minister Mark Carney and President Xi Jinping. For many in Washington, this news came as a shock. Only a year ago, relations between Ottawa and Beijing were frozen, strained by disputes over canola, seafood, and the detention of Canadian citizens. Yet now the same two nations are moving toward dialogue, trade, and cooperation. What changed? The answer lies not in Beijing, but in Washington. President Donald Trump's trade policies were meant to protect American industry and bring Canada closer under U.S. control. Instead, his tariff war has fractured North America's supply chains and pushed Canada to look elsewhere. Trump's 25% import tax on medium and heavy trucks takes effect in November, adding to a long list of duties on steel, aluminum, autos, and furniture. The goal was to pressure Canada to return manufacturing jobs to U.S. soil. The result has been the opposite. Rather than yielding to Trump, Ottawa is quietly reshaping its global position. One trade deal, one conversation, and one handshake at a time. In Ottawa, the mood is cautious but determined. After months of failed negotiations with Washington, the Carter government has begun to de-escalate. A new 100-page order published this month removes dozens of counter-tariffs on both the U.S. and China. The policy shift is sweeping. Many categories of Chinese steel and aluminum, previously restricted, can now enter Canada duty-free. Tariffs on American steel, health equipment, and even construction materials have been reduced. One Ottawa housing project, for instance, received an exemption to import steel doors tax-free. The reaction at home has been mixed.
Canada's steel industry warned that cheaper Chinese imports could flood the market.
Ontario Premier Doug Ford urged a tougher line, saying the country must not bend under Trump's pressure. But Mark Carney took a different approach. There are times to hit back and times to talk, he told reporters. Now is the time to talk. Behind that calm tone lies a deeper calculation. Canada's auto sector has been hit hard since Stellantis announced it would move Jeep Compass production from Ontario to Illinois. 3,000 Canadian jobs lost, 1,000 gained in the U.S. The same tariffs designed to boost American manufacturing have crippled Ontario's supply chain. By easing counter tariffs, Carney is trying to stabilize costs for domestic producers and keep inflation from rising. More importantly, he's signaling to Washington that Canada still has options, and one of them is Beijing. As China hints at lifting restrictions on canola and seafood, both sides are preparing to discuss EV tariffs. If these talks succeed, it would mark the first real thaw between the two countries since 2018. For Carney, it is not about choosing China over the U.S. It is about restoring leverage. In a world where Trump controls the economic board, Trump's tariffs were supposed to isolate China and reinforce U.S. dominance in North American trade. Instead, they have created an opening that China is quick to exploit. Beijing's economy has slowed and exports need new markets. Canada, a G7 democracy with strained U.S. ties, fits perfectly. By reopening trade with Ottawa, China gains both an economic partner and a diplomatic bridge into the Western world. For the United States, this shift carries real consequences. Canadian importers now find Chinese metals and components cheaper than U.S. products, weighed down by tariffs. Canadian farmers previously locked out of Chinese markets may regain access for canola and pork. In short, China is regaining ground through the very system Washington tried to weaponize. Meanwhile, the U.S. industrial heartland, the Midwest, is feeling the cost. Higher steel and transport prices are eating into profits. According to the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, American construction firms have seen material costs rise by nearly 12% since early 2024. For them, Trump's trade war is not protection, it is punishment. And yet the ripple effects stretch far beyond economics. Global investors are quietly adjusting their forecasts, shifting billions of dollars from U.S. assets into Canada's resource and manufacturing sectors. Ottawa's reputation as a stable gateway to both Western and Asian markets is gaining traction. While America's unpredictability under Trump is driving partners to hedge their bets, even European automakers are now eyeing joint ventures in Canada to bypass U.S. tariffs and access cheaper Chinese materials. What began as a tariff wall has become a bridge, one connecting Beijing to North America through Canadian soil. And as Ottawa reopens its doors to Chinese trade, American exporters risk losing a loyal customer. Canada remains the United States' largest export market. If even a fraction of that commerce shifts toward Asia, U.S. manufacturers could lose billions in annual revenue. The irony is sharp. Trump promised to bring jobs home and weaken Beijing's reach, but his approach has pushed Canada, America's closest ally, to cooperate with China instead. The more Washington tightens, the more Ottawa looks for air. For decades, Washington stood at the center of North America's economy. Every major supply chain from autos to agriculture ran through the United States. But that order is now shifting. Canada is quietly building a more independent path, one that connects west to east rather than north to south. The upcoming Carney meeting, if confirmed, will symbolize that evolution. For China, the summit would mark a small diplomatic victory. For Canada, it would prove that middle powers can still navigate between giants. In this new landscape, Trump's tariffs look less like strength and more like self-inflicted isolation. His America First policy has left allies searching for alternatives. Canada's outreach to China is not a betrayal. It is a reflection of a global economy that refuses to stand still. The message is clear. When trade becomes a weapon, nations find new allies. Canada's decision to reopen with China may reshape the balance of power in North America, forcing Washington to confront the limits of its own strategy. Trump's tariffs were meant to rebuild American control. Instead, they have rebuilt Canada's independence. And as the world watches Ottawa's next move, one thing is certain: the ripple effects of this policy reversal will extend far beyond Beijing, far beyond Washington, and deep into the future of the North American economy.